Welcome to our November webinar, a collaborative presentation of the Federation for Children with Special Needs and the Recruitment Training and Support Center, RTSC. I am Yvonne Rigo, Project Associate, and today's webinar is the Accompanied Refugee Minor Program presented by Ailish Donovan. Ailish Donovan is currently the Senior Program Manager for Ascentria Care Alliance's, formerly known as Lutheran Social Services, Unaccompanied Refugee Minor Program, and Division of Children's Services Program. Ailish has worked at Ascentria Care Alliance for over 6 years. She holds an MSW from Boston University School of Social Work, is an LICSW in Massachusetts, and is an adjunct faculty for the BSW program at Anna Maria College. Ailish has worked with refugee populations for more than 10 years, specializing in child welfare work with unaccompanied refugee children for 8 years. She can be reached at adonovan@ascentria.org. During the webinar, please type your questions in the toolbox, and we will try and answer them during the presentation or after. Past webinars are archived on the RTSC website, along with many resources on trauma and learning and educational issues that impact students in child welfare. Handouts will be emailed after the webinar. Welcome, Ailish.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. So before we get started, I like to give a quick overview on Ascentria Care Alliance. We were formerly known as Lutheran Social Services of New England. We operate in 5 different states throughout New England. We have a variety of services in each of those states. Our mission is that we're called to strengthen communities by empowering people to respond to life's challenges. And currently here in Massachusetts, we are the only provider of the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor Program. There are a number of other programs in 13 other states. So we are the only one here in Massachusetts and here in New England. So a quick slide, we often shorten the long name of unaccompanied refugee minors into URM. So just to clarify, we utilize the term URM, and that means unaccompanied refugee minor, but as you'll learn, we're not just serving refugee minors, there are certainly other minors as well. And again, we also will refer to the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor Program, or URM, and again, in that case, we are referring to a foster care program for a specific group of youth who enter the country unaccompanied or without caregivers or parents. And that is one of our URMs right here on the slide. Beautiful picture. So to get started, I like to go over a brief history of the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor Program. After that, we'll get into some demographics. We'll talk a little bit about the various immigration statuses that the youth enter with. We won't get into the weeds too much with that, but just a brief overview. We'll also discuss services offered to the youth, as well as a brief overview of life before the youth enter our program, and finish up with kind of overall goals and pathways that we see for the youth. So the history of the URM program, this is a national program that began on a federal level in response to youth who became unaccompanied as a result of various wars in Southeast Asia. So we're talking about youth from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and we saw these youth enter the program in the 1980s. And the program operated that way for the next decade or so. And as these youth began to age out of the program, we saw some Haitian youth enter the program, but really the program got quite small. One thing to note that happened in the 1990s was the 1997 Flora Settlement, which some people may be hearing because we're hearing so much about youth who are crossing the border. And basically this settlement kind of said when youth come into custody of the federal government, when they are apprehended at the border, these are the types of services that they have to have. So it kind of laid out some of those things. And this is significant because it does affect some of the youth that end up entering the URM program later. In the early 2000s, we did see the Lost Boys of Sudan. Many people may have heard of this term before. These were young men and women. I mean, they were older youth who had fled war in their home country of Sudan and basically walked all the way to Ethiopia and then back to Kenya seeking safety. Many of their villages had been destroyed as a result of the war. And so in the early 2000s, we saw a number of what was colloquially termed the Lost Boys enter the program. In 2008, a very significant piece of legislation happened called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And this contained legislation that gave certain types of statuses to youth and then made them eligible for the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor program. So specifically, this was Special Immigrant Juvenile status, also known as SIJ, and trafficking victim status as well. We'll get into that a little bit more later. As a result of this legislation, we start to see children from Central America begin to enter the program. These were youth who crossed typically the southern border between Mexico and the United States. Here we are in 2019, more than a decade later, and the program exists serving a multitude of youth from various countries, various immigration statuses, and it's still very robust today. And I have a couple pictures of the older groups that we saw in the earlier days. So these were Cambodian youth at a refugee camp on the Thai border. And this is a picture of Sudanese youth walking from Sudan, Ethiopia. The program here in Massachusetts operates mostly in response to a lot of partners that we have. Sometimes I joke and say we have a lot of bosses, but we have a lot of wonderful partners that make this program possible. So as I mentioned before, this is a federal program, and so we do work with the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement, also known as ORR. We are connected to a national agency called Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, who primarily works with our refugee referrals specifically. And here in the state of Massachusetts, we work with the Massachusetts Office for Refugees and Immigrants, also known as ORI, and we directly have a contract with the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families. An important thing to note about the URM program is that any child who enters this program then becomes in the care or custody of the Department of Children and Families and is therefore eligible to any of the same services or benefits that any other child in the care or custody of DCF would be. So that's just kind of explaining what I've just explained here, but it is a very important takeaway because while we do provide some specialized services, we also primarily act kind of like a mini, what you would call area office for DCF in many ways. So getting into the eligibility for the URM program, this is a very specific program. It's not open to a lot of children. They have to come through referrals either through the federal office, the Office for Refugee Resettlement, or the State Department who manages refugee referrals specifically. So going into the three categories of eligibility, all children must enter the program before they're 18, and they must emancipate at the age of 22. So we see a lot of youth enter very, very close to their 18th birthday, but the rule is they have to enter before 18. So sometimes we see they're going to turn 18 in 2 days and they may enter our program then. They must have one of the following immigration statuses. There's a couple of other ones, but these are the common ones that we see. We will go over the definitions in a minute. Refugee, asylee, trafficking eligibility letter or visa, special immigrant juvenile status, or Cuban Haitian entrant. And they have to be unaccompanied. They must have, experienced some type of abuse, neglect, abandonment by a caretaker, and there's nobody else here in this country to care for them or their other country that they, country of origin that they may have come from. A brief overview on the referral process. So we kind of look at this in two paths here. The first path are our refugee children who are arriving from overseas. We would call these our overseas referrals. These are children who have already achieved refugee status by the United Nations for Commission for Higher Commission for Refugees, UNHCR. So these are refugee children living in refugee camps or other areas, other cities all over the world. They are referred by the State Department to national, what's termed VOLAGs. That's a shortened term for voluntary agencies. There's a number of voluntary agencies throughout the country, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services being one of them, and U.S. Bishops for Catholic Charities is the second one that manages specifically unaccompanied refugee minors. As some of you may have heard recently in the news, we are looking at a very low refugee cap that is put in place by the presidential determination. As of last week, the presidential determination was 18,000 refugees will be allowed to enter, and this is in comparison to prior administrations where the number was closer to 80,000. So we are seeing a very, very significant cut. There is not the unaccompanied refugee minors have not been, pointed out in this number, but we would probably still see some a lessening of children. Border referrals. So these are what the federal government terms as unaccompanied alien children. That's not really a term that we use. We'll sometimes use the term UC, just unaccompanied child. These are kids who have crossed the southern border typically, but they could have come in through any port of entry, and they're referred by the Office for Refugee Resettlement as they are in federal custody before they enter our program. Typically, these are youth who are coming from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America. So just doing a brief overview on immigration status. I like this infographic, even though it leaves off one of the groups here, but a refugee is legally defined as a person who is outside his or her country of nationality and is unable to return due to a well-founded fear of persecution because of his or her race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group. That's the last one. So that's just the standard definition of refugee, and they have to meet that definition according to UNHCR in typically the country that the refugee has fled to. So for example, if we take the current events of people leaving Syria due to the civil war and they flee to Jordan, they would receive refugee status potentially in the country of Jordan. And from there, it would be determined where can you be resettled to. Do you stay in Jordan? Do you go somewhere else? Can a country like the United States take you, or Sweden or Norway, for example? So that's some of the process that happens, but it's an important definition to keep in your head, because the next one that we talk about is asylee. And asylee is literally the same definition. The only difference is that the person comes here to the United States first and then achieves that status. So they may enter the country without documentation, or they may enter with some type of travel visa, and then they would receive the status after they've been here in the United States. Two differences between refugees and asylees, that's it. Victim of trafficking, the very Detailed definition is it is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of commercial sex act or labor services, again, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. So we do see children entering the program with what's called a trafficking eligibility letter, and this means that a lawyer has determined that they are likely eligible for a trafficking visa. But it's a very intensive case to pursue. So often the children will enter with this letter and then they will work towards their case later. The last important status to know is special immigrant juvenile. These are children who are physically present here in the United States. They must be under the age of 21. They cannot return to their country of origin. One or both parents abused, neglected, or abandoned the child. Getting into some of the program demographics, the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor Program here at Ascentria has been in operation since the 80s, and to date we've served a total of 700 URMs. We currently have a capacity to serve 165 youth at any given time. Today we have probably about 150 youth in care, and the only reason why we don't have the full 165 is because we don't have enough foster homes, don't have enough placements to actually receive the children, unfortunately. On a national level, 13,000 youth have been served since 1980, and there are 1,300 kids in care currently. Demographic wise, in terms of country of origin, see just over 50% from Central America, about 25% from African countries, and another 20% from Southeast Asian countries. That kind of shifts here and there, so just an approximate. Gender breakdown, in the past we used to see 75 to 25% breakdown, 75% male, 25% female. We've now seen an increase in females arriving, and so we're at a 65 to 35% breakdown. Overall number of unaccompanied children at the border, all of the information you've been hearing on the news. In 2016, we had a very large surge of children across the border. There were 60,000, and as at this point, we are going to surpass the 60,000 in 2019. Just a visual graphic of where our children come from. So as I mentioned, in African countries, we're seeing a little bit more of a spike at this point. We're about 30% because a number of refugees from Eritrea have entered our program. That's a small country next to Ethiopia. But we also have children from the Congo and Somalia, Central America, as I mentioned, Northern Triangle, so Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and some from Mexico. In Southeast Asia, in the past, we saw a number of youth enter from Burma, which is now known as Myanmar, Nepal, Bhutan, and we still are seeing referrals from Afghanistan and Pakistan as well. We have children who represent other countries, but these are kind of our major countries at this point. A lot of people then ask, well, why are youth leaving their countries? And this is kind of a short list of reasons, but I think kind of captures some of the bigger ideas. So first and foremost, youth may be fleeing war or conflict. They may be abandoned or neglected from their family. In Central America, there is quite a bit of community violence and gang threats. For example, the capital of Honduras, Tegucigalpa, has the highest rate of murder in the whole world. It is not a safe place. Youth may be fleeing domestic abuse, physical, sexual, or emotional. They may be fleeing extreme persecution, either because of their ethnic background, their family's political beliefs, or religion. There may be little to no opportunities for education or work, severe poverty, family reunification, so they may have other family members here that they may be traveling to be reunified with, or they could be trafficked here, and that's a very real possibility. So I'd like to kind of give folks a little bit of an overview of what life in a refugee camp is like. These are two pictures of refugee camps, and what you can see is first in the first picture on the left, this is not a place that is set up for permanent living, obviously, and yet people spend 1 to 2 decades in camps sometimes. Also, you're in a situation where you're kind of reliant on waiting for people to provide goods and services, as oftentimes refugees are not able to work in the community and just overall become a part of the community. So here people are gathering water, they're still looking at just getting basic needs met. And that's kind of what the text goes into a little bit here on the slide. Some refugees spend more than a decade in camps, and that can include children. They could have entered the camp when they were 5 years old, and they could be leaving when they're 15. So our minors could have spent some time with families, or they might have been in more of like an orphanage setting. It really depends on the situation. They will have lacked rights afforded to citizens of that area, including work authorization. Very vulnerable to exploitation, physical and psychological hardship, danger, and health risks. So on the one hand, while a refugee camp can be more safe than the situation that folks fled from, it still is not the safest or the first choice for people by any means. I like to use this picture. It's a picture of a school setting for a refugee camp, just to kind of give folks an idea of this may be what children have been used to, and then they enter an American school setting, which is very different, and there's just a lot of adjustment and overall catching up to do. Other pictures of refugee camps. So for example, there's a refugee camp called Dadaab in Kenya that was built for 90,000 people, and it currently holds over 400,000 people. So they are very, very overcrowded. And you know, the current situation where we are accepting less and less refugees every year is not helping that. The next situation that we like to touch on is border crossing experience. These are youth who are making up more than 50% of our population at this time. And so the picture we have here are actually of youth riding on a train. These trains are trains that go through Mexico, and people, including youth, will jump on top of to get from one place to the next. It's called La Bestia. It otherwise known as the Beast, because it is such an unsafe way of traveling. Often our youth who have entered the program will report seeing people killed from jumping on the train, maimed from jumping on the train, people who are held at gunpoint, robbed, you know, sexually assaulted. It's a very, very unsafe experience, and yet people do it because they have no other option. As we mentioned before, kids can cross the border for a variety of reasons. They could be economic reasons, family reunification reasons, or safety. And youth are traveling here however they can. So they're going to go by foot, by train, as I mentioned before, with coyotes and or traffickers. It's kind of smuggled here, which on the one hand people can see as being it's safer because there's somebody to guide you, but on the other hand these people might not be good people, and the youth can be exploited as a result. So once they're here in the US, they may be apprehended by the Department of Homeland Security or Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. Those are abbreviated to DHS or ICE. Pictures I have here on the slide, you know, the first one we see the youth coming into contact with ICE officials. A second picture is a youth crossing the Rio Grande. Then we have a picture of the border, youth traveling together in a group, and then, you know, a youth being being in a detention center, essentially. So there's another picture of youth in a detention facility in Nogales, Arizona. Youth who are sleeping on a floor in a detention center in Brownsville, Texas. These are all pictures that were actually taken prior to the Trump administration. This is something that has gone on for a very, very long time, certainly not to the extent that the Trump administration has put into place, but youth who were apprehended at the border, they were put in detention for 72 hours. Now we're seeing youth in detention for much longer. So the next part that I like to get into is how does the Erm program support minors? What do we do? And we have a picture of one of our Erm youth and foster families here. It's a great picture. First, I like to talk about placement options. As I mentioned, youth are eligible for the same services that any child in Department of Children and Families would be eligible for. So they can be placed in a regular foster home, which we, Ascentria Care Alliance, have licensed and trained to especially to work with this population. They can be, placed into an intensive foster care placement if they have needs that are, they have more therapeutic needs, essentially. They can be placed into group care, again, if a group setting is going to be better, potentially. And lastly, if there were significant concerns, we may utilize a residential care, but that is very rare. Also, because we work with youth who are much older, they enter the program very close to being 18 often, we very much utilize a pre-independent living model and eventually an independent living model. One of our goals is to see our youth really be living successfully independently before they leave our program. Picture here again is another of our foster families with 2 of our unaccompanied youth. Other services that we provide, so indirect financial support for housing, food, clothing, medical care, and other necessities, intensive case management by social workers. Each youth is assigned a social worker. And I like to say one of the nice things about this program is that we have the opportunity of working with the youth often for at least 4 years. The youth typically choose to stay with us until they're 22. And I think that nowadays, that's not something that you'd see in case management settings. So it's the relationships that the kids get to build is really wonderful, and we get to see those small little successes, which is kind of offset some of the challenges, I would say. Independent living skills training, very, very important. We do a lot of focusing on that. Many of these youth may have learned some independent skills in their previous country of origin, but they may not be very adaptable to here in the United States. So it's about trying to capitalize on what independent living skills they have here. And then how do you kind of use them here in the United States? How can we help you with that? Help you navigate, things like that. Educational support's very big. Youth are eligible for the same education supports that youth in Department of Children and Families Care are eligible for. So they're often eligible for education training vouchers, for example. Many of our youth enter our program with educational gaps, not a lot of education, sometimes they are not even literate in their own language, so they have a lot of catching up to do in a lot of ways. And our youth tend to be really motivated to do that catching up, to graduate high school or a high school equivalent program and enter some type of post-secondary education, which is great to see. Again, yeah, we get into English language training. That is a big focus for us as well. Career and college counseling. Certainly we connect youth with mental health services specifically for their trauma and experiences as needed. Youth are also working towards an immigration status often. As we talked about, they may enter the program with one of the statuses that we discussed, but then they need to achieve permanent residency. And once they leave our program, they can also apply for citizenship. So we work with youth on all of those fronts as well. We try our best to connect youth to cultural activities, bring various youth together. We have program-wide events where we bring the youth together, so it can be a really nice opportunity for the youth and kind of do some of the recreation and connection to social integration. So goals of the program, as I mentioned before, we really are working towards helping our youth develop skills to live independently when they reach adulthood and when they leave our program. So helping youth finish their education, developing job skills, finding employment, making those lifelong connections and achieving permanency. This is a really, really big focus for us. Many of our youth have gotten to where they've gotten often because they've been very independent, and we spend a lot of time trying to help youth understand the importance of positive adult relationships, whether that be with their foster parent or with a pastor at their church or with a volunteer at their school, or you know, we have a program called Community Connections where we try to connect youth to some of those positive adult relationships. We know from the research that this is one of the primary indicators of success later on in adulthood. So we spend a lot of time making sure that that is something that happens. Teaching life skills, money management, housekeeping, food shopping, meal preparing, what you do when you need to go to the doctor, calling the doctor, making the appointment, all of that stuff. Problem solving and conflict resolution. So we work with the kids on all of these skills. So this youth here in the picture, he graduated high school and got an associate's degree. He is currently a very successful manager at McDonald's. He hires some of our youth for jobs, which is great. And he is recently reunified with his sister. So it's just a great success story for us. Pathways, educational career pathways for our youth. We see youth pursuing a wide variety. Many youth will graduate high school and enter a community college setting to kind of get their feet wet with college classes, and may eventually transfer into a four-year school. Certificate programs such as a CNA or a CMA, a certified medical assistant. We have also had youth go to medical school. I mean, we have some really, really, to us, they're all great success stories, but we have a really wide range. We also see youth get commercial driver's license and a lot of success at programs like Youth Build, Job Corps, some other construction, carpentry type jobs as well. This is a most recent picture here of some of our youth and their case managers who graduated in 2019. We always hold a graduation party for our youth. So that's always a really fun opportunity. And one of our youth who graduated with his foster parent. So emancipation, this is what we call aging out for our youth. When they turn 22, they do emancipate, but they have an option of applying for an extension per the Department of Children and Family Policy. Many of our youth take advantage of that because they're often smack in the middle of finishing school. So youth will apply for a limited extension to kind of get them through that semester of school or whatever, wherever they are. Prior to this, 6 months prior to aging out, we start working with the youth on a discharge plan. For 3 months after emancipation, we provide aftercare services. This doesn't mean regular visits, but it means we're going to check in, we're going to see how things are going, what's popped up, what can we help to connect you with, kind of just, so we're trying to just maintain that connection for the youth, and we still see youth come back to us even after those 3 months often. Other services, they continue to be eligible for Mass Health through age 26 and other DCF related education assistance. Kind of an overview of challenges and strengths that we see for our youth. Challenges, social connectedness. We often see youth isolate. As opposed to some of those acting out type behaviors, we don't see that as much as we might see a youth isolate from their foster family, from their school, from things like that. So we spend some time trying to help youth learn some other coping skills, I would say. The emancipation age, youth enter often so close to the 18th birthday that we, end up, we have 4 years isn't that long for all the work that they have to do, essentially. Level of trauma that the youth have experienced, everybody is different, everyone's had different experiences, but that, that can be a real challenge for youth, as it often, they can be in survival mode for a long time, and eventually that catches up, and we try to do our best to connect kids to services that will help address some of the trauma. Lastly, the education gap that I mentioned, that can be a really big challenge as the youth are entering school so late, and they have to learn English, sometimes learn literacy, and be ready to emancipate in a couple of years and be independent on their own strengths. The youth are incredibly hardworking. There is a very, very strong value in education. These are often not youth that we have to prompt to go to school. The youth, they want to go to school. Very, very resilient, as you can imagine. The stories, experiences are just amazing. And I've just noticed over the years working with them, we see this level of stewardship, the level of wanting to just give back. Youth who leave the program they'll want to come back and be a mentor for other youth. They'll want to enter careers like teaching, social work, nursing, police officers. The people who help them, they get really inspired and want to give back. So I think that's something that should be noted. This is a list of some good documentaries and books, and there's a lot of other documentaries coming out, particularly about youth who are crossing the border. I didn't have them listed here, but these are just a few that we've noted here at the program that are great. Questions?
We actually do have a question.
Okay.
From Lynn McCormick. She wrote, can you work with an older teen who comes in with a younger sibling, and can they be kept together in an independent living home?
So it's hard to give an answer about a specific situation. I'd be happy to talk offline about that particular situation. I can speak to, historically, we have had situations where we've had older youth who are over 18 become kinship placements for the younger siblings, where we've made them, the older youth, a foster parent if they're over 18, and kept the younger sibling together. Certainly, being in the field of child welfare, that's always our first and foremost, just goal is to keep families together, keep kids connected to those relationships that are important. So.
Okay. And I had a question in regards to the refugee versus asylee status. Is there a time constraint as to when a refugee will then in turn become an asylee in this country?
They don't become an asylee. So refugees, when they arrive here, they are eligible to achieve permanent residency 1 year after arrival. An asylee is the same thing. 1 year after they get asylum, they would get permanent residency. But there's no going from refugee to asylee. The next step is permanent residency, green card, and then 5 years after getting refugee status or asylum status, they would be eligible for citizenship.
Okay. And then you also mentioned there was an increase in female arrivals the last decade or several years?
Right.
Is that due to sex trafficking and an increase in human trafficking in the country?
I think it's due to the changes in demographics, seeing more youth enter from Central America. We are seeing more females enter from those countries. It may be that the journey is shorter and they get here without potentially something else happening. I think that females who are waiting in refugee camps, there's kind of a lot of things that we can see happen, or they may just end up staying with family for whatever reason, cultural perhaps. So I think the answer is mixed. I think certainly, yes, we've seen an increase in trafficking referrals. So we do see more females come in that way, but also it could just be that we're seeing more females come from Central America in general.
When a family is interested in becoming a foster parent or providing a home to a youth in this program, what would be the steps to take in order to
become a foster parent? So they would fill out an initial inquiry form, speak with our recruiter, learn if this is something that might be a good fit, and then complete an application, go through the Massachusetts Approach to Parenting Partnerships MAP training, which is the training that any family goes through in the state if they are going to become foster parents. We hold our own kind of specific training that will also address working with unaccompanied refugee minors, but it is the same training that anybody will go through across the state. And once they've gone through that training, a home study is written in partnership with a family resource coordinator, somebody that they would work with, get to know the family more. Once their home is licensed, we would then look to find a good match. So the process takes, it can take anywhere from 3 to 6 months. It really depends on how motivated people are. But we're always looking for foster parents. So if this is something you're interested in, we definitely encourage you to go to our website at ascentria.org/URM, and you'll find more information about inquiring and connecting with our foster family resource recruiter.
Is there any kind of specific training for families who become foster parents to help with the cultural diversity or the language barrier, anything like that, to help them sort of, bridge that gap with the youth?
Sure. So a lot of our trainings focus on helping folks become more culturally aware, I would say. Well, if we see a group of youth who are entering from one particular culture, we'll develop resources around that culture. In terms of language, it's not always an easy option. We've been lucky to have folks who are Spanish speaking, and placing a Spanish speaking youth in their home, then that becomes a little bit easier. On the other hand, we have youth who come from places like Eritrea, and the primary language in Eritrea is Tigrinya, and we don't have a lot of people who speak Tigrinya, for example. That being said, we do help foster parents kind of figure out other ways of communicating, kind of creative ways of communicating with the youth, and then we'll also provide an interpreter, interpreter options depending on the situation, at least in those initial months while the youth is learning English.
Great. I have another question here. How do they work with kids with so many different languages, and what are communication strategies and tools? I know you just started mentioning some of that in terms of foster families.
It really depends on the situation. So first of all, right, we can't possibly have a perfect match of families and social workers with kids and languages. So Ascentria actually, we operate interpreting and translation service called Language Bank. This is a really great business because it works specifically with refugees who Ascentria has worked with to train them as interpreters and then hire them at Language Bank. So we work very closely with Language Bank to have telephonic or in-person interpreters available. And then we'll also work with families to be creative with how they can communicate, whether it's kind of drawing pictures and, you know, labeling things around the house, whether it is, you know, just utilizing utilizing Google Translate for certain things. But when we get to times where we really, you know, we need to make sure that communication is very clear, then we'll utilize our interpreter and translator. But as I said, it really depends on the situation in terms of the tools that we end up using.
Great. I think that's it for our questions. If anyone else has any other questions, feel free to send them to us. Thank you. Oh, we do. So given that you do have a limit of serving up to 165 children at a time, what happens to the other children who won't qualify or cannot be supported by URM?
What I can say is right now we turn away referrals every day because we don't have enough foster homes. So that's kind of already happening. And unfortunately, youth age out. Once they turn 18, they can't enter this program. So if they're in refugee camps, that means they may be rerouted to the adult resettlement program and wait to be resettled from that program. Obviously, the expectations are far different. So the difference between somebody who's 17 and 18 is really big. For youth who are across the U.S.-Mexico border, we typically would say we see that they're discharged. Potentially, sometime in the Trump administration, we're seeing that they're deported. That's it. You know, in previous administrations, that's not what we would see. They would have been given a discharge plan and be allowed in the community, but at this point now they're being deported.
And if they are part of the program and then they emancipate at 22,
Mm-hmm.
does that automatically guarantee that they would then, you know, that's a good pathway to citizenship? Does that guarantee citizenship, or is there still a fear with, you know, kids aging out of the program that they might be deported thereafter?
Up until now, I can say I could say pretty confidently that youth had some type of permanent status. Now we're seeing a lot of delays with immigration cases. So I don't know if things will look a little bit different over the next 2 years. You know, the one positive thing is that they are connected to legal services when they're with us. So we're able to really make sure that they get every potential opportunity that they can for legal support. And then they are educated to know to come back and go to our citizenship clinic, connect with our, we have an immigration department in our, at our agency, you know, connect with them when they're eligible for citizenship. So I think that's positive. I think some of it is just teaching those self-advocacy skills that other youth may not have the opportunity to learn.
Can they apply for citizenship prior to 22? Is there any avenues of them doing that, or no?
It's an odd rule, but while they're in the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor program, they cannot become citizens. So what we often do is we'll get them like started on that paperwork before they discharge from us, so that we get that going, but they don't actually become citizens until they leave the program.
Have there been foster parents who opt to adopt the child and
Yes.
then sort of file their own paperwork towards citizenship at that point?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
We don't have a lot of younger kids, but we do have some, and particularly the younger kids, we've had a few adoptions, and as a result of that, then the youth would get citizenship after that. Yeah.
Okay. What is the typical demographic then, the age that you work with?
I like to say 16 to 20, you know, like that's like the median. But we have kids that are as young as, let's see, like 9. And then, you know, we have kids up through the age of 22. Typically, if they are that young, they're coming with a sibling, because you have to imagine how is a youth that's younger than 9 going to travel either on their own through like Central America or be on their own in a refugee camp. Typically a kid that young, probably a family would start taking care of them just informally, right? But those kids that are in that 14, 15 age range, that's when they start to kind of take care of themselves in those crisis situations.
Well, very good. Thank you so much, Ailish.
Thank you. Thanks for listening, everybody.
And that was extremely informative. I'm so happy you were here. And well, I'd like to remind everyone that you will receive a follow-up survey and the handout. If you can please complete the survey and send it back, that would be great. We value this information so that we can provide everyone with the most effective information to support the wonderful work that you do in supporting children. And today is the last day, just as a reminder, to register for RTSC Making a Difference Conference, which is a week from today. Please visit our website at www.fcsn.org/RTSC for more information. Thank you very much again for joining us, and have a great day.